I want to welcome everyone to the show. I'm your host, Richard Hara, and this is Social Impact Live, a weekly conversation with members of the Columbia School of Social Work community. Pleased to welcome to the program today two guests. First, we have Adina Barrios Brooks, who's Assistant Provost for Faculty Advancement at the Office of the Provost of Columbia University. In addition, we also have Karma Lowe, Assistant Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Columbia School of Social Work. So Provost Barrios Brooks, Dean Lowe, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Richard.
We're going to be talking soon about our featured topic, which is how can Columbia be an anti-racist community? Certainly occasioned by a recent talk that Ibram X. Kendi gave that we hosted here at the School of Social Work. But before sort of getting to this moment, I guess I wonder, since this is a rare treat for us. I mean, on this program, we often have researchers, right? We have people who are teaching at the School of Social Work. We've had students and so on. But, I'm trying to think, maybe this is one of the few times that we've had administrators, right, from our school to come here and talk about what I think is a very important component of academic practice and what we're doing at a programmatic level, right, through administration, to support the larger objectives of our university. So I'm just curious, Karma, I think everybody knows you who's been through the School of Social Work over the last 20 years or so. So in a way, you don't need introduction, but I'll have you introduce yourself soon. But Provost Barrios Brooks, could you tell us a little bit about the office where you work and your role there?
Sure. So I work within the Office of the Provost and the Office of the Provost for Faculty and Vice Provost for Faculty Advancement. And our portfolio really focuses on faculty. It started, I started in the office, actually my anniversary was 5 years ago yesterday. And when I joined the office, our focus was on faculty diversity and inclusion across the university. And that really initially meant a focus on recruitment and retention of diverse faculty, but over time came to include creating a climate of inclusiveness across the university. Our portfolio expanded again last year to include faculty development as well as the Office of Work Life. So we've grown a bit, but our focus still remains very much on creating a climate where faculty, no matter who they are, no matter where they come from, can thrive. Because we know that excellence and diversity go hand in hand. We cannot be an excellent university if we're not also a diverse university. And so that's really been the focus of our office's work over the past 5 or 6 years.
Okay, wonderful. And Karma, if you could tell us a little bit about your title and your role at the Columbia School of Social Work.
Sure, Richard. So my title is Assistant Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and that office was only created a couple of years ago. And I have to give full credit to our students and alums who, starting in the 2015-2016 academic year, really pushed the administration via a list of demands. And number one on that list of demands was the creation of a multicultural center, which evolved into what is now the Office of DEI and an assistant dean role. And we've been doing this kind of work at the school for many, many years, as you know, Richard, but not in sort of a formalized, under the support of an office with a dean and with a team of folks that could really push initiatives across the school. And I think initially when the office was created, there was sort of this sense that it would be primarily student focused, because most of my background at social work, I've been there 17 years, not quite 20 yet, is really student focused. And it really quickly became apparent that it's not the students that needed all the work. To Dina's point about sort of how the Vice Provost Office and Faculty Advancement has sort of expanded, it's like we really needed to focus on faculty and also administrators. Like it needed to be this holistic view. And so, the charge that I was given under both interim Dean Garfinkel and now Dean Begg was really to build an office that had programming and services that serviced the entire CSSW community. And I've been really lucky to have colleagues like Adina, who had met through various circles at Columbia University, where sort of the stars aligned and our offices converge, where we can expand that. So it's not just about focusing on the CSSW community, but then also figuring out how can we bring our expertise to the wider Columbia community and vice versa. And so having partnerships like bringing in Dr. Kende recently and other partnerships and working collaboratively with Adina and other diversity officers has really helped to expand not just my role, but also just exposure of our students, our faculty and staff to what's happening across the university.
That's wonderful, and I'll go right back to Adina and ask you. So when and how did the School of Social Work sort of get on your radar at the Office of the Provost? I'm just curious.
I'm not exactly sure how long. Maybe 3 or 4 years ago, we founded a diversity officers work group. Our office co-convenes it with the Office of University Life and brought together administrators doing DEI work across the university. And I was so lucky to meet Karma and other colleagues and really hear about the amazing things that were happening already, as Karma mentioned, at the school level, but also share some of what was happening at the university level with our school counterparts. And so we meet at least quarterly as a group, and that was just amazing. We also had, our office had the advantage of knowing now Dean Begg when she was in her vice provost role, of Vice Provost of Academic Programs and some of the members of her team. And so we were very excited to collaborate with her in her new role at Social Work, knowing that there was such talent on the ground with Karma and also with some of the faculty that we had already worked with at the School of Social Work on an individual basis. And we were looking for ways to collaborate. And I would say, late last fall, well before COVID, well before anything, Dean Begg and her team came to us and said, we'd really like to host Ibram Kendi. And we really think that would be a way to showcase our commitment to racial justice and to really continue and push this conversation about anti-racism. And of course, we were like, amazing. And so the vision was to do that at the forum, which would require co-sponsorship because an in-person event obviously can carry quite a bit of cost, but also that we would help the School of Social Work really make sure that the word got out beyond social work, that social work is doing really exciting and important work. And so that was great. And we were all planning and meeting and going to the forum. And I remember going there on a very cold day with Chief of Staff Susan Smith to figure out what it would look like and scope it all out. And then COVID hit. And we didn't, and the event was postponed. And then George Floyd was murdered. And it was clear that if that conversation was important in January and in February, it was vital in May and in June and over the summer months. So we worked together to repurpose the event that ultimately was the conversation that happened last week.
Okay. Yeah, and yeah, so this has been ongoing, and certainly the murder of George Floyd was a pivotal moment, and yeah, now it is a moment, I think, and I'm just curious. You've been following this conversation literally for years now. What is different about this moment that you can tell? Either for our society. I mean, if you're willing to have that conversation, but I think within Columbia. I mean, has the conversation changed? Are we really moving somewhere different now?
I think we are, and I think Adina can probably agree with me on this. There's definitely momentum, and it definitely is a movement. I think and there's sort of reason why I was smiling earlier is that there are a lot of us, I don't want to speak for the monolithic Black community, but a lot of folks who've been doing this work and have this lived experience feel like, why did it take this to build that momentum? Because you've always known racism exists, right? We've always known it's out there. And I think perhaps it's just the fact that we are in a pandemic and folks are on lockdown and you're sort of forced to reckon with what's happening, societally, right? We can't ignore what happened to George Floyd, to Breonna Taylor, and, whatever the reasoning for it, I'm grateful that there's a heightened awareness, right? It's unfortunate that it took these acts of deaths to sort of raise that level of awareness, but it's here. And so, so the hopeful side of me is like, well, let's take hold of that awareness. Let's take hold of this momentum of folks that, may have considered themselves to be very progressive in thought, but sort of laying back, in the background, are now ready and willing to step forward and move to the foreground. And so we'll take those accomplices, right? And we'll take that momentum and like, how do we build on that? And I think that's why, and Nadine and I talked about this before around, it's sort of fueling our desire to continue this work. And we have partners on the ground who've always been on the front lines with you, but now you feel like, oh, here are some new folks sort of joining the movement. And the only other remaining question is, will it be sustainable for them? Like, will they be able to run the marathon? Because that's what we need now. The heightened awareness level needs to stay at that level, if not grow higher. And that was something that, Dr. Kendi touched on last week as well.
Before we go on, I just want to remind our viewers that we do reserve the last 10 minutes of the program for Q&A. So if you've got some questions, please write them into the chat box so that we can actually bring them into the conversation a little bit earlier rather than later. It's always great to have feedback and to involve our audience in the conversation as much as we're able to. So yeah, let me go back to you, Adina. So do you see it now as, not just greater awareness, but more widespread, across the Columbia community, you think? And that's helping to really give this movement a little bit of momentum, at least administratively?
I do. I would add, I agree with everything, of course, Karma said, but I would add that I think that the impact of COVID on communities of color and the Black community in particular, I think also really laid bare the structural inequities that have always been there in a new and unavoidable kind of way, and both in health, obviously, and in terms of pre-existing conditions and access to healthcare. But I think of it even in K-12 education. Now we think about, the kids that are most likely to be learning remotely are kids of color, and the kids that are more likely to be in the classroom are white students. And so I think in every sphere of life and in every sphere of our society, we're seeing these inequities really that are unavoidable to be seen. And so I think that reality is really encouraging many individuals in the Columbia community, both administrators, faculty, and staff, to rethink about what their role might be in pursuing justice. And we've seen that so I'll just give a short example to fast forward. One of the things that we did this summer was launch a seed grant program open to Columbia faculty for projects $5,000 to $10,000 that really promoted racial justice. And we, I think in a normal year would have expected a modest amount of applications, and we would have happily funded them. And we received triple the amount of applications we expected. And many of the faculty who applied, some were known to us and people who have been doing this work for some time, but many were new. And that was, as Karma said, really invigorating and exciting. And I think that their desire to step into the game is really very different. I've worked here for 15 years, and I think this kind of momentum is really new. And I think the challenge will now be, what's next? Can they stick in there? Because it is a marathon. It definitely is not a sprint.
Yeah, and Karma, maybe, speaking from the perspective of the School of Social Work, right, where it's something that we've been working on for years at our school, and is it sustainable? What does that process look like over the long term? What are your observations, and maybe what are your suggestions to Adina?
I think my observations are that without our students, we wouldn't be moving anywhere. So I think I have to give a lot of great gratitude to our students and our alums. But I think, the school's in a great position where we really have come to embrace the fact that it has to be a holistic approach. And that started, really concretely with the revamping of our curriculum. The students called for a mandatory course on power, race, oppression, and privilege, or rooted in that lens. And, working with faculty, Drs. Cogburn and Williams developed what is now a required course, what we call Prop Foundations, Decolonizing Social Work Practice. And I think, a lot of other schools at Columbia have also reached out to us around like, how can we sort of decolonize our curriculum, and how can we suffuse that sort of a lens, or an anti-Black racism lens across the humanities, the sciences, et cetera. And so I think the fact that that's happening shows that people are invested in sustainability, because if you sort of institutionalize it in that way, then you really are building a sustainable path. I think, our partnerships with Adina and Dennis Mitchell's team with the Mini Institute, the provost came to us, Dennis and Adina came to the School of Social Work and said, hey, your expertise in anti-Black racism or anti-racist practice is rooted here. What can we do to provide sort of your expertise to faculty writ large? And so we had Drs. Courtney Cogburn, Jelana Harris, Alvita Williams, and Zuleika Henderson developed a mini institute on addressing anti-Black racism, which we've trained. I think the first cohort was about a little under 70 faculty across the 17 schools at Columbia. We're now working with the provost cabinet and deans across the university. And so I think, both at the school level as well as the university level, sustainability is showing that we need to do top-down training. We need to also address curriculum. We also need to build in support. Adina mentioned their office is focusing on retention, and the same thing is happening at the School of Social Work. It's not just enough to bring in a diverse class of students, right? It's not just enough to recruit and bring in, Black faculty. It's how do we support them? How do we mentor them? How do we create a climate where they can thrive and not just survive? And I think, particularly at the School of Social Work, there are a lot of faculty members and administrators, across identities that are really invested in doing that, and that gives me a lot of hope, right? And that I think will determine our sustainability, because folks are ready to dig in, and they're training. It's great. They're training for the marathon. So.
Well, I'm glad to hear that the response from faculty has been largely positive. We have a question here. How do you move faculty who are not responsive to this kind of work? They might say they are, but I'm talking about actions, approach with students, especially BIPOC interventions. So yeah, are we really seeing in the wider university, Adina, a real hard look at curriculum and aspects that need to be addressed in order to, change what may be perpetuating systemic racism in our classes? There's a lot there.
There's a lot there. I think that something that is important to kind of frame this conversation is, as most people are probably aware, Columbia is an incredibly decentralized university. So there is not really one answer to your question, in the sense that I think that in many schools, and social work is definitely in the vanguard in that respect, but not alone, there is intense work happening at the curricular level of revisiting and thinking about requirements, course offerings, what kind of faculty and what kind of expertise is sort of missing, and what should that look like. But it's not universal, I would say. And I think that what Karma said is so vital. It is the students that are pushing, right? And I'm not going to call out particular schools, but I would say that there are schools that maybe have not done as much work in this area, and their students are not letting them off the hook. And I think in a good way. And so I do think that is part of how you move faculty. I think the other thing, and the Mini Institute has been a really great example of this, is we have to create community for faculty to be able to have allies. And we were talking before the show, I actually once ran very slowly a marathon. And the trick there for completing it, however painfully slow it was finding other people to run with. And I was assigned to the Slowpoke group, because I was a slowpoke. And we trained every week together. We did our long runs on Sunday, and we checked in during the rest of the week to make sure everybody was doing the training that they needed to do. And we all completed the marathon. It was the Marine Corps in DC, in case you're wondering. And I think that that is a really great analogy for this work, which is that it is not done alone. In fact, it's almost impossible to do alone. And that to the extent that those of us have made it our work and are sustaining it, it is in large part because of our relationships and our partnerships with others doing this work. And I think we are seeing movement where new players are asking people who have been doing this for a while, what can I do? What have you done? I think there's real desire not to recreate the wheel. And I'm hearing from new folks to say like, well, what are the what infrastructure already does exist? What needs to be built? And who can do it with me? And I think that that makes me very optimistic.
Carmen, do you want to add to that, or?
I think the only thing I would add is I haven't encountered faculty who, I wouldn't say they're not responsive. I think it's more about, it's just to build on what Adina just said, sort of the hesitancy of, I don't even know where to begin, or I'm sort of nervous to enter this space. And so in those cases, I feel what's been most effective is really just the one-on-one conversations. And I know that that can be time consuming, and folks can talk about the burden that places on particularly folks of color, or people, people like me in my particular role, but it's also the area where you can have the most impact and the most growth. And so I think when we create larger conversations and folks who are, particularly if you're white identified and you're just uncomfortable with talking about racism, or you're really just now starting to sort of reckon with sort of your whiteness and what that means and how you show up in the world, it may not be the easiest space for you to be in a large room, even via Zoom, to have those conversations. But if you're able to have, a natural dialogue with a colleague, like Adina was saying, like someone who's going to say, hey, I see that you want to take this next step. Here's how we can do it together. I'm going to help sort of bring you along, and so you can join the larger group conversation and be able to sit with that discomfort in a productive way, right? So I'm not saying you're avoiding it or avoiding the conversation, and not necessarily coddling your feelings, but really, how do we give you the tools to be able to enter the larger dialogue where you feel like, okay, I can, not only am I moving myself individually, but being part of a collective movement.
So I think you're addressing one of our audience members' questions. How do we make this momentum sustainable for the duration of the marathon on the administrative faculty side? And I think what you're pointing to is a more personal approach, right? Sort of getting people to do that kind of self-inventory, but in collaboration and in concert with other people, right? Who can support, who can, I think at times challenge, right? And to really create the kind of atmosphere and community really that's necessary in order to move this work forward.
Yeah, we also have to not forget about community care and self-care, right? So as we're talking about building an anti-racist institution, I think part of one of the things the institution can do is also build mechanisms for support, particularly for our Black, Indigenous, people of color on the administrative side and the faculty side, because the reality is there is a larger burden placed on folks that identify in those areas. And the sustainability piece is, how do I take care of myself? How do I continue to find joy? How do I continue to feel supported? How do I continue to be in a climate where I feel like I belong and I'm included in a very real and concrete way, and not just sort of in a performative way? And so I think it's sort of this, the both and, as we say in social work, right? So on the one side, it's how are we pushing people towards an anti-racist institution, and really pushing people to think differently, to think critically, to think about their positionality, think about their social identities. And then also, how do we support those same BIPOC folks, those same queer folks who are living an experience of feeling marginalized and feeling like they're having to do more of the work, within that environment. So finding that balance with the both and, I think, is going to be critical to that sustainability.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that as much as we want to sort of set up sort of different constituencies, if you will, sort of faculty, administration, students, and so on, there is a tremendous amount of diversity within those groups, and the way that the different parts are interacting with one another, again, needs to be managed. I think we need help, we need support, and hopefully some guidance in really moving this conversation in a productive direction. We have another question here. Dr. Kendi talked about the importance of building interdisciplinary teams and drawing on different intellectual traditions in order to be an anti-racist university. How do you see that happening at Columbia? And maybe since you brought up the different schools before, Adina, you can tell us, I mean, what sort of mechanisms can we put in place to really move, from awareness to action here?
So I think there are a lot of exciting ways that is already happening and can be built upon. So I think it's been a little over a year that the Institute for Research on African American Studies became a full-fledged department. And I think that that's really exciting because it is one of the few intrinsically interdisciplinary departments at the university. And I think that will continue to be a space for that kind of interdisciplinary work, but with more autonomy than an institute, because they can actually hire their own faculty, and also just more standing in terms of attracting those kind of scholars and the conversation that is so important. This year we will have just launched a call for a cluster hire for scholars in the area of race and racism, and our expectation is that those will come from all corners of the university, including the professional schools, including the arts and sciences, really to create a center of gravity where people can continue to have those conversations. But I think something that's really important to note, and we've talked about this a lot, is very little of this work is new, and much of this work has been being done by faculty who've been here a long time, by administrators who have been serving in these roles, and what was once called multicultural affairs and now is called diversity, equity, and inclusion work that may one day be renamed anti-racist work. It is really on the same continuum, and I think it is really important to acknowledge the work that has already been done and the shoulders that we all stand on, that really have created the space for us to further and push the conversation, because there is no line of demarcation where it was this and now it's something new. This is part of the same story, and I think that it is important to really honor those folks that have done this work.
I'm just curious, I mean, and this is a basic question that somebody's asking from the audience, but does Columbia require faculty to participate in workshops or trainings to continuously learn about how to be anti-racist, diverse, inclusive? I mean, is this sort of, you mentioned expectations, right? I mean, are we developing expectations for faculty in this area?
I'll say two things. I mean, I'm fairly certain that it is required at social work for faculty to participate in prop. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that's the case. It is not the case that it is required across the university. And I'll say this, I think that there is an open question about whether or not if faculty participated because it was required, that it would actually achieve the goal that I think those people who are in favor of these kinds of trainings and these kinds of workshops, the literature is not clear on whether or not a required one-size-fits-all training for any group of people would achieve the goals that folks would have. I am seeing much more interest in getting these sorts of trainings. And so the Mini Institute, and I think I want to underline something Karma said, because I think it's really important, and it goes to the sustainability question. The fact that the Mini Institute started with a group of 70 faculty and now has moved to the Council of Deans and other senior university leaders is really quite something in the amount of time. And it is really an accomplishment, a testament to the work of the 4 instructors and the School of Social Work that built the curriculum that could be deployed in that way. I think the idea that every dean of every school at Columbia is going through this exercise has the potential of being transformative, and for them to figure out and think about what kind of training or workshop or whatever you want to call it makes sense for the faculty in their school. And that actually has the potential of being much more powerful than some, if anybody's ever done the sexual harassment training that's required, it's not necessarily moving hearts and minds, right? I mean, and so I think we really, to be more targeted, to be more thoughtful, I think allows us the potential of having much more impact.
Well, I see that we're at 12:30 and we'll probably just run a few minutes over if that's okay with your schedules, because I think, at this point, I just want to wrap things up with your thoughts, kind of in response to the talk that Dr. Kendi gave the other day, but also, all right, we're at this moment now, and not to look too far ahead, but where do we go from here? I mean, how do we take these ideas about being anti-racist, right? Not simply not being racist in our attitudes, right? and so on, but actually, sort of implementing policy change, right? That stops racism and people being affected by racism. I mean, what do you see as sort of the next steps here? As we're trying to build that anti-racist community at Columbia? I know, big question.
I'd say it's a great question. I think it's a simple answer for me, at least, that there's nothing really new to do. I mean, just like being aware of racism was nothing new. I think all the things that we've talked about, again, and I've mentioned on this last half hour, plus all the things that we haven't had a chance to mention that are happening at the university, I think we just need to continue that work and continue building that momentum. And whether that's starting with small, intimate conversations, whether it's the Mini Institute, whether it's these larger forums. I mean, I think one of the key takeaways for me from Dr. Kendi's talk last week was just the idea that to be anti-racist means to be active. So as long as you're remaining active in this work, and active not just on the work front per se, but are you having these kinds of conversations in your intimate spaces with your family, with your friends? Are you really taking sort of making a lifestyle change, that you're constantly thinking about what it means to be anti-racist in all of your actions? And are you, the committees that you sit on, are you sort of exploring and looking at the policies or how those committees operate? Who's represented on those committees? So if you're asking yourself those questions, if you're remaining active in that way, then I think that's the work that needs to continue. And I'm pretty hopeful that that's easy enough for folks to do. We're not, and we talked about this when we were prepping for the program, we don't want to ask folks to dismantle the entire system overnight, because then you're going to feel stymied by how large of a thing that is to do, right? But you can slowly chip away at it. Again, if you're on the admissions committee, dig into the admissions committee policies. Who's represented? How are applications being reviewed? How are you recruiting and pipelining people into your admissions cycle? If you're on a hiring committee, same thing. How is the job description written? Where are you advertising? How are you recruiting candidates for that? Who's on the hiring committee? Little things like that, I think, will make a huge difference in sort of creating an anti-racist community across the university.
Yeah, again, it's not just simply the personal and the individual, but what you as an individual in your role as an administrator as well can do to affect change. And again, that's why I'm so happy to have you both here today. Adina, I'll let you have the last word. Action steps, things that you want to see in the future?
I think it is so exciting that so many people are asking this question of what can I do? And I think that that is very much what Karma said is right on point. And that can be admissions, it can be hiring, it can be curriculum, it can be I think something that's top of mind for me is how are the structures in whatever unit you're in, how are you treating and thinking about the staff that work in them, right? Something that has come to mind in my mind is that Columbia University is in Harlem and in Upper Manhattan, and many of the people who clean our buildings and serve our food are the people who are impacted by the structural racism that affects us all in ways that affects their life chances. And I think as citizens of Columbia, to be mindful and thoughtful about ways to make sure that it really is a place, we talk about meritocracy in higher education, that there is opportunity and that that we are mindful of the impact of the legacy of the 400 plus years of racism and in our country have on all the members of our community, and to be that to me, if we were able to do that more mindfully as a community, would be an incredible victory for all of us.
Absolutely, and the work continues. So I want to thank you both, Assistant Provost Adina Berrios Brooks and Assistant Dean Karma Lowe, for joining us here today at Social Impact Live. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Richard.
Thanks, Richard.
Thank you. Next week, we'll have Rob Hartley and Sarah Jamgoch to talk about social work votes and what social workers can do to get out the vote. So that's another action I think that we all need to think about at this time. So until then, thank you all. It's great to see you. Take care. See you next time. Bye-bye.